Okay. All right, everyone, let's get started for today. Before we get going, uh, anything about the exam? Anything about the class so far? That any comments, concerns? Okay. Yeah, Pearson has been giving a lot of students some issues, so just for a one-time thing, there'll be an extension. The final extension for all the week one stuff is for tonight. So if you have issues, now is like your last chance to get help on this. So please ask, if you need anything, because we're here to help. Otherwise, we'd be getting started with our next topic. So if you take a look at our syllabus, right, we have, we're up to, today is day 6. So we're going to be doing chapter 5 today, all the stuff that's due. Tomorrow we'll be doing chapter 6, then there'll be chapter 7, and the following Monday, chapter 8, and then the following Tuesday is exam 2. So the next set of assignments, 5, 6, and 7, will be due Monday night. We've changed this from Sunday. That way you have time to ask us in class if you were working it over the weekend and you need a little bit of guidance. So just these 3 will be due on Monday, 6:15. The next exam will be on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. But given that chapter 8 was done the previous day, it will have less focus on chapter 8. Similar to how this previous exam had less focus on the more newer concepts. That way you guys had a little more time to review it. And then looking forward, we'll have the next 1, 2, 3, 4 topics for the final exam. So we'll have all of this updated as well as we go along through the weeks. But for now, this is all that we need to worry about for the time being. Okay, so we're going to be reviewing the subtotal function a little bit. So over here, right, we had originally used our sum function, right? But the problem with this is that if you turn on the filter and you hide some of like the records, right? It still is going to end up displaying that same total, right? We need to change this a little bit, right? And that's what our subtotal function is going to be doing. So we spoke a little bit about that last week, but we're going to talk a little bit more about it today. And for this specific one, right, it's going to end up dynamically recalculating to show the sum of only those visible rows, right? So this is going to end up making it a little bit easier for us to see, right? Especially if we only want to filter a sum based on a certain number of rows. So rather than only displaying one grand total, this will always be changing. And we'll be going more in depth about this, especially with like regarding whether to use like 9, whether to use like 109, whether you do sum, etc. So we'll be going more in depth with that later on, but just kind of a refresher of with our subtotal function. Okay, so let's get going for today. So today we're going to be kind of continuing a little bit more with our tables, but we're going to add a lot more power to them. We're going to be going over what's called a pivot table, which allows us to keep the data stagnant, but allows us to essentially move things around so that way they're displayed in a much easier to see format. This is really great for things like displaying a total, for example, where maybe you want to only display the total for a specific part and you want to make sure that things can be dynamically changed, right? Before, when we were doing things with a normal table or just a normal spreadsheet, things were always stagnant. If we changed something, it would be a permanent change. I can't just switch my columns and rows without having some repercussions on that. So this allows us to analyze our data in a much more efficient manner. Okay, so we went over a little bit of our subtotal. right? So subtotal also has a lot more features to it as well. We can use our subtotal function in a couple of different manners. So let me pull up the spreadsheet that I was working on with this, right? Let's say I have a bunch of data over here, right? Now, I could hard code a subtotal function if I want, right? I could do equal subtotal, right? And have to include the parameters, right? And we see from last time, there's a lot of different function names here, right? All of these are based on a specific number. So we have like the average, the count, count A for count all cells, right? Regular count skips the blank ones. Max, min, product, standard deviations. Then we kind of get into, it looks kind of like a repeat, right? We have 101, 102, 103, etc. The difference between these guys, right, the 100 range and the non-100 range, right, is whether or not they're going to end up hiding these specific values as we filter through our spreadsheet over here, right? So if I wanted to just say like find the average of like whatever range it is, right? Oops, let's just say we want to find the average of this row over here, right? I'm just going to enter that and boom, it does that for me, right? Now, I could also use our function a little bit as well, similar to how we have it on our oops, on how we have it on our dialog box here, right? And this can allow me to change things a little bit more in depth. Rather than just using a function, just outputting a total or whatever, I could actually have this filtered a little bit more. So instead, right, let's say I wanted to instead, right, head to my data tab, actually formulas, yeah, formulas, right? And let's see. Um, and if I wanted to, right, I could essentially use our subtotal function through here instead, right? And let me see, what would I do? Okay. Instead of doing that, right, I could I'm sorry, I forgot exactly
I think
where
it's in
it
data to the right of the ribbon.
Sorry, what was that?
I think it's in data and then all the way to the right, subtotal.
Oh, right there. Gotcha. Thank you.
No problem.
All right. Yeah, so instead of actually using our subtotal function, right? What if I wanted to use the subtotal over here, right? Of course, I'm going to get an error because I don't have anything selected. But if let's say I was to select my sheet over here, right? This time, instead of going by one thing, I select the whole spreadsheet. And I can now use my subtotal function to essentially change things up as I go along. I could say if I want to take the total of the retail unit, I could say if I wanted to take the total of the subject, I could use any of these different functions. And what's great about the subtotal is that it'll also automatically detect if I have text or not in these fields, right? So let's say I were to do that, right? Now I have things grouped super nicely. And it actually is going to take the subtotal of each of the categories. So I have this a little bit nicer over here, right? Where it actually would take the total of all of the art books, let's say, all of the business books, all of the computer science books, etc. And it groups it based on those things, right? So it takes from these wholesale units, it'll take the sum of all of the art books and output it here. Right? We could see it automatically calculates our subtotal instead of us having to calculate the subtotal of this category, this category, this category, this category. We're doing it using our subtotal up here. And it automatically takes that based on each category. What I can even do here is it also changed my sidebar view here. I have now these little minus signs. I can condense all of these categories to only show the totals themselves. So if I have a spreadsheet that has hundreds and hundreds of rows of data, right? I don't really want to see every single piece of data. Maybe I only want to see the total based on each subject, right? I can do that by condensing these guys however I please, right? And if I want just the grand total, I click the minimizer in the corner and I can just see the grand total over here instead. So this also is going to end up affecting any other formulas that we have. You might have noticed I have this little box over here, right? This subtotal function, this one is not using the 9 like we have over here. This one is using 109. So anytime that I show or hide any of these values, this guy is going to be changing over here. These guys do not change because I have 9 here versus 109. So both 9 and 109 are sum functions for the subtotal function, but 9 keeps the eternal sum. 109 is going to hide or subtract from that sum when any of these categories get hidden. So anytime that I expand these columns, these rows over here, my sum grows bigger and bigger and bigger. But if I contract them a little bit, right, it's going to end up changing. What does not change? Over here, subtotal when I use the 9 function. This one kept with the original 223,592, even when I hid all of these guys. But anytime that I hid them, this guy over here would grow and shrink dynamically. So it's important to think about, do I want my data changing dynamically or do I want it to stay stagnant? If I want my sum or my average or any of it to stay stagnant, I'm going to be using these single digit functions, right? We had 9 for the sum. I could use 1 for the average. I could find the max, I could find the min, etc. But I want to use the single digits. If I want this to grow and shrink based on what is showing and hiding, then I need to use the triple digit ones. That's going to be my 101, 102, 103, 109, etc. Don't worry about memorizing specific numbers. Just know what the purpose of this number does. So any questions on the subtotal function? So we can hard code it ourselves, or if we want to group by certain categories, then we would use in our data tab right here, our subtotal. So if I were to select my raw data, like how I had it over here, if I had my raw data over here instead, right? Okay, it's making me undo the previous one. But what I could do is I could select all of this, go to the subtotal, and I could change it however I would like it to be changed. So if I want things grouped together by subject, subcategory, book title, edition, right? I could take the sum of these functions. I could take the count. Maybe I'm not dealing with numbers in terms of maybe the price or the retail units. Maybe I'm just dealing with counting how many textbooks I have, right? Count could be a good option for that. I could take the average, max, min, etc. But what's great about using this subtotal rather than hard coding it ourselves is that it automatically groups these guys. And we're going to learn more about why this is so powerful when we get up to our pivot tables.
So, Professor,
Yeah, what's
so
up?
you see how it says book title on column D?
Yeah,
Is that a category in this? That should be a category in the subtotal, right?
yeah.
So if I just wanted to find the like how I'm looking at the subtotal is basically a better version of like a filter. So,
Yes.
um, if I wanted to just filter out the harmonic materials and tonal music, I can use a subtotal to figure that out. If I don't know
So
if that's like the objective of it, but
So subtotal is more about creating a function
mm,
to kind of analyze the data. For instance, if I wanted to sum up how many art books I have, or if I wanted to see, how many wholesale units or retail units there would be. If I wanted to filter out specifically, let's say this harmonic materials, I could instead use a pivot table, which is what we're going to get to in a moment. So
okay,
pivot tables work very closely with our subtotal function, right? But they take our idea of a regular table one step further. It allows us to keep our data here stagnant, but we can essentially filter and we can organize things without losing our references or without having any issues like that.
okay,
So we're going to end up having something that looks a lot more like this. And we have a lot of filters here, right, that can allow me to filter for any of these topics that I might want. So if I
mm,
wanted to search only for the harmonic materials, I could just select that there, and it would end up only showing that, right? Which allows me to easily filter this. It's like a much better version of the filter function.
yeah, got you, understood. So, super quick, can you
Mhm.
go back to the other sheet where you had the subtotal at, and can you just find like can you just find I think it was the other one, the one that was more completed, or maybe it was that one.
Yeah,
Any of
this
them,
was the
yeah.
better one.
So, can you just like pick anything that you want to use the subtotal for and do it, and then I'll just apply that with like I just want to see you do it, and then I'll apply that concept for me to find something with the filter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure thing. So this one over here was already done, right? So what is this subtotal under? It's comparing our wholesale units sold and our actually this is what it's built into. This is based on our wholesale units sold and our retail unit price.
Okay.
So over here, right, we see that it's based in this case, we're taking the sum of our wholesale units sold and our retail unit price. So
Mm,
the art total, business total, computer science total, etc., all of this is being organized based on that. Now, I could change this if I wanted to. I could change this to it wouldn't really make sense to sum up the other stuff, but let's just say we changed it to maybe count instead, and we counted the number of the subjects or something, and we added that on top of there. So if you notice, this time it's counting. So it's saying I have 4 art books, and we can just
mm.
see that this is counting the number of options that I have here. So it's not taking the sum of these guys anymore. If
It's
I
just
wanted,
counting. Got you. Okay,
you
so
got
sorry,
it.
super quick. So, um, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. Okay, I get it. Thank you.
No problem. Always love those light bulb moments. Yeah, so there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with this. And honestly, the best way of doing it is playing with it yourself because, you could take a look at this and be like, oh, I have, for instance, I could take the average. I could find the max. I could do all these kinds of things, right? Let's see what happens if I pop up on the max and I say max retail unit price. Maybe we find the most expensive book. So this time, right, our grand max is the most expensive book at $176, right? That's this guy over here. So maybe I want to filter it a little bit more, right? Instead of just that, maybe I am grouping it based on subject instead, right? Or let's see, perhaps like book title or maybe wholesale units sold. So this function seems to work a little bit different, but the key here is that it's essentially finding that max value for whichever ones that I'm given.
Yeah,
So
and the reason, sorry, and the reason why it's a zero on book title right now is because that's not a quantity, right? That's not like a unit size that it can find, that the max formula can find.
precisely, exactly.
Okay.
See, you see the difference between text and numbers.
Yeah.
And that's how our function is exactly working in that case. So you got to be careful what kind of data that you're using. And, maybe instead of using our subtotal for function four, right? Function four was the max. I might just count this. I could use multiple functions. I could change it up, right? So if I wanted to change this instead, right, I could essentially mix and match which kinds of functions that I want to use. But the key here is I want to make sure that I'm using, right, if I have text, maybe I want to count things instead of summing up numbers. So we can use all different types of functions with that. So with that being said, let's continue on, right? So I kind of pretty much summed up a lot of what was kind of going on here. They kind of show a lot of like the dialogue boxes and stuff, but don't really show how to do it per se. So wanted to kind of take the time to walk through it a little bit. But this is our subtotal dialog box, right? That's what we just had up. We can filter here. So these are the columns that we choose to have a subtotal to. And again, we can choose whichever functions that we want, etc. And we could see over here at each change in subject. So I could choose, right, if I wanted to, let's say, change based on, right, our subject, right? Now this is going to organize it based on that subject, right? I change this up, boom, we see that we have the art max, the business max, computer science max, healthcare max, right? I could filter essentially based on any of these subjects. So if I wanted to, I could change this instead to, I don't know, let's say book title, right? Now every book title is essentially its own category. So this is allowing us now to filter kind of based on that in a sense. So at each change in is going to be the category I'm filtering on. The function is the function I'm using at each, and add subtotal, which columns do I want to use? So this is kind of like our row, and this is kind of like our column going on. And again, I can switch things around. I think this subject makes it a little bit clearer in this case, right? Um, so I could just choose to essentially switch things up and pretty much sum up or find the max of any of these columns that I choose, right? So you have to find the method that works best for your data, essentially. Okay, so that's just kind of another example, right? This is pretty much similar to the example that we had, but you could see how this could be very helpful when we have so much data going on, right? You don't want to read all through all this stuff. You can collapse, show, and hide these specific values, which is nice and handy. You can even group data if you want. So this automatically groups your data, right? But maybe I want to group together like these guys or something, right? So I can group and ungroup these guys as I please. So I group them together, and now I could show and hide them just like that, right? So you can show what data you want to show, organize it however you'd like. That subtotal function is really powerful. And it's going to work extremely well when we get up to our pivot tables as well. Okay, so here's a pivot table, right? So we've gone over regular sheets, we've gone over tables. Now we're getting into pivot tables. So all a pivot table really is a way to project our data into something a lot more organized. I have my original data set here, and I'm creating a pivot table that displays it differently. So a normal table, right, organizes our spreadsheet, but maybe we need things filtered, right? Maybe we want to only show a specific row or column, or, right, we want to have our grand total function. Our pivot table is going to kind of do a lot of what our subtotal function is doing, right? So maybe we want to kind of have it a little more organized in that regard. This is where our pivot table is going to come into effect. So I can choose where I want the data to be coming from and then click on Insert Pivot Table, right? So whatever data that I choose that I want, right? Just like how we would for a normal table, I could choose if I wanted to be on a new worksheet completely or if I want it to be on an existing worksheet, right? Maybe I want them next to each other. Maybe I want them on two separate sheets. Either is totally fine. So when you see a blank pivot table for the first time, it's going to give you this little placeholder here, right? You have to specify what panes that you want to see here. So this is going to be very similar to our subtotal where we choose exactly what we want to specify. So let's say I want to make a pivot table out of this over here, right? I'm going to have over here, insert pivot table, right? And I've already formatted this nicely with my subtotal. So I have my max per subject, I have my grand max total, etc. Right? So whatever I choose, I could choose the range over here. And let's just say I want to make a new worksheet entirely. Let's just keep it nice and organized, right? Now, this is going to give me an error because I've already used my automatic subtotals here, right? So pivot tables are going to kind of do a lot of what subtotals do. So because of that, I have to have an unformatted sheet like this over here. So if I take over here, right, I'm going to put a pivot table here. And this time it actually works because that doesn't have any subtotals that we've already done. So again, I have my little placeholder over here. So it says to build a report, choose the fields from the left, or from, sorry, from the right. So we have over here all of our different fields, right? So what do I want to include? Maybe I want to include my subject, subcategories, book titles, editions, copyright, wholesale units. I could add as many or as few as I want of these guys. Let's just have all of our data here, right? We could choose to hide things later on. So I have all of this over here, and we see that we have this kind of automatically kind of filtering based on our different subjects over here, right? So we have things kind of organized a little bit, but we can do a lot more with it. So we made our little pivot table here, right? So similar to how it's over here. And we can also see that we have these four little parameters down here, right? They're blank at first, but now, right, we can clearly see what our rows and our columns are, right? And we could see what specific values there are. So the rows and columns are pretty self-explanatory, but the values themselves, right? This is going to take whatever data that I have and it's going to do some function on it, right? We could see we have a little sigma here. Sigma is a symbol that represents a sum function. So this values is going to essentially be doing the work and doing maybe the sum or the count or the average of whatever values we want, right? Because when we intersect our rows and our columns, maybe we want to sum things up. Maybe we want to find the average, find the max. Very similar to how we did our subtotals. So just like how we had our subtotals, but this time we have more control of how we are going to view things. So if we take a look, right, once we actually create our pivot table, we have all four of these parameters over here, right? So again, we could choose to filter a little bit more as I kind of showed before. We can see the specific columns that we have, the rows that we have, the values themselves, right? I could say whatever function that I want here. These are the four main components of our pivot table. And because pivot tables allow us to mix and match things a lot, it's going to help us a lot when it comes down to how we want to display this. So there's a lot of different ways that we can navigate these guys, right? Especially when we have a lot of data going on, right? If I go to my navigation pane, right, what I can essentially say is I can navigate through whatever fields that I want of over here, right? So I can go to my view and I can pretty much choose to, oops, I can choose to pretty much display it however I want, right? Maybe I want to show the total sales, maybe I want to show the units sold, data, etc., right? I can do all of this from my navigation pane. I can choose to add different fields to my specific rows and columns, right? The key with pivot tables is that whatever I do here, whatever I change here, does not change the original data, right? I could choose to display this however I'd like, but essentially, whatever I do will not change the original format of my original data. Now, I'm not able to actually change the values themselves. That's what's very important too. Pivot tables are simply projections, right? They're not going to uh, be editable in that way. I could just change how it looks. I can't change the actual data itself. So if I want to actually change, let's say, maybe a specific textbook name, right? Or maybe the year or the price, right? Let's say the price got changed. Okay, well, I have to go back to my original data and change it. This will not let me change it. If I try to change a value here, right? If I double click it, it gives me the detail itself. But if I try to actually change it, it says we can't change it, right? Pivot tables are just a projection. Just like how you have recommended charts, there's also recommended pivot tables, right? Maybe you don't want to hard code this yourself, right? Maybe you just want to see what your default pivot table would look like, right? So I could do that too. I could go to recommended pivot tables and it's going to kind of present this, right? This is what it thinks that I want to show, right? And this is not really that helpful. I mean, I guess it kind of is. It shows that I have like one I have account, I have one accounting book, I have one anatomy book, I have like two database books, etc. This might not be exactly what you want. But again, you can use this as a basis, right? And change things as I go along. Maybe I want to include copyright or I want to include prices. I want to include all different things like this. I can choose to do that, and maybe I want to have a grand total somewhere along the lines. I can choose to include that. I can choose to not include that, right? Not all pivot tables are the same, but what's great about it is that we're free to organize it however we choose, right? So this tells you a lot more, right? We have all of our different prices all nice and organized based on our subject and everything, all great. So you can choose to use the recommended, or you can kind of build it up yourself. Okay, and just like with our subtotals, we can collapse and expand as we go along, right? So maybe I don't want to necessarily get rid of something by unchecking it, but I want to just expand or collapse a certain field, similar to hiding or showing specific values. I could do the exact same thing here. So again, allows you to kind of see what specific data you have. You can kind of pick and choose, and you can really play around with it. And let's say you're doing a presentation and you only want to show maybe the totals, maybe the total number of revenue. You can change that just by the way that you viewed the specific pivot table. Okay, and you can do all kinds of other things too, remove the different fields, rearrange the fields too, right? That's pretty cool. I can choose to move things up or down, right? Maybe I want to move this up. I can essentially, let me do it on the other one. It's a little easier to see, right? Maybe I want to move this up, right? I could scroll down. I could move it up to the beginning. I can move it up, down, end, wherever. So let's just say I want to move it up. Now that whole row has been moved up a bit. Now you're probably saying, but wouldn't this mess up formulas? Because don't we hard code formulas based on their cell position? You would be right. So we need a different way of dealing with that. And we're going to get to that, right, by using the get pivot data function. So this is going to essentially hard code where we are getting our data from, right? Instead of just saying, okay, A1, B4, etc., which can actually change as we pivot our data, let's say, this here is going to hard code it. It's going to essentially say, take my data field. Okay, this is whatever column I'm in. Let's just say total book sales. It's going to hard code whatever data is in the current A4 block, right? And let's just say the total book sales, it was like 100 books. This is hard coded as 100 now. So if I move wherever, let's say I moved the A4 to B7. Maybe I moved it around, I filtered, I sorted alphabetically, whatever I did. This is still going to have the original value. That will not change. So if I wanted to show an example of that, right? Let me zoom in this way because PowerPoints just don't like to work for some reason, right? Let's say I had over here total sales and it hard codes A3. So if we want to take a look at whatever they're giving you, right? If I decide to change what is in A3, right? Maybe I decided that I wanted to move it around. It's going to still keep this data present. So I have an example of that, right? From, see, too many pivot tables going on. Right here, I think this is where it was. So this one over here has get pivot table. This one, I'm just going to hard code the cell itself. So this is coming from over here. This is B5. So I'm going to hard code B5 right there. Okay, they're equal. Great. So let's just say that this was going to be involved in a function or something, right? Doesn't really matter what it's going to be used for, but I'm going to change things up a bit. Pivot tables allow me to filter, right? So I'm going to click this little drop down. I could sort, I could do all things. I'm just going to do something as simple as sorting alphabetically or in ascending or descending order, right? Ascending goes from A to Z, descending from Z to A. So right now it's already in ascending order, so I'm going to switch it to descending. And just like that, the numbers changed. What happened? Well, this guy over here was hard coded, right? This guy was not. B5 is now this value here because they swapped the order. Now, get pivot table on the other hand, well, this was hard coded. This actually stood the same, right? So this now, because I gave the exact coordinates that it's located at, it's at sum of wholesale units, book title applied sequel, right? I can now say, oh, okay, I know that this is the sum of wholesale units that corresponds to the applied sequel book, right? And if I wanted to get something else, right, I could say get pivot data, right? I could just click on any of these and it'll automatically populate it for me, right? Let's just say I wanted to get the sum of copyright of theater exploration. This is going to tell me that it is the sum of copyright of theater exploration. This accidentally put a second get pivot function, so let's just get rid of that. So that way it'll actually work correctly. So I have equal get pivot data, and it's telling me get the sum of copyright. A3 is just the starting point, right? This is the starting point of my pivot table. And it's saying get the sum of copyright from the theater exploration book title. So I enter that and boom, I get 2028. Again, if I were to hard code C4 there and I switch the order, or maybe I move things around, because remember, I can right click and I can move it up and down as I please too, right? That's going to cause issues as well. So pivot tables are always pivoting. They're always moving. We don't want to change the data itself. So now it's more than just hard coding a reference. It's more than even just using dollar signs, right? Dollar signs are just going to eternally keep it as B5 if we're doing a fill command, right? We don't want that here. So that's kind of the magic of using this type of function here. So again, with pivot tables, just be careful. You want to make sure that you are referring to the correct thing. Okay. Okay, so we can move the various labels and everything. We kind of went over that. Filtering is very powerful, right? I could filter not just by ascending and descending. I could sort by the book title. I could sort by any of these things. If my pivot table was larger, I'd have more fields here, right? But I kept this one shorter. I could filter by label, value. I could select all. I could select some, right? If I took all these off, and I put some of them on there, right? I can do something like that. If you notice, I get reference errors because these values are being hidden. They don't exist right now. This guy is always changing because it's hard coded to whatever is being shown. Maybe some are being shown, maybe some are not being shown, right? Always changing. Always use the get pivot data function when you're using a pivot table. Because notice, if it's not appearing, I get a reference error because it is clearly not there. It's not trying to make up some data that's just going to appear there. Okay, let's go over slicers and then we'll take a bit of a break. So what are slicers? Well, slicers give me these really nice little interactive boxes here that kind of just allow me to pretty much play around with these different things, right? I'm going to just clear this filter over here so we could see it a little bit more. So to see this over here, I can click on any of these guys and it filters based on corporate finance, accounting, applied SQL, whatever it is. Maybe I want applied SQL edition 10. Okay, well, that book doesn't exist, so it doesn't appear, right? I can go to the highlighted one and see, okay, well, it is edition 2. That does work. And even if that edition is not here, right? It's just not displayed. I know that edition comes from here. All of this data is where this guy is coming from. So anything here is going to be displayed here, even if I don't have it necessarily in my projection pivot table. So if I want to essentially have one of these slicers, right? Let me just clear the filter up here and up here so it displays everything again, right? I could select everything and I can go to my pivot table analyze, and I could insert a slicer for whatever thing that I want, right? Maybe I want to add, let's see, this was book title, edition. I don't know, maybe I want to filter by copyright year. Boom, another one appeared. I could do all kinds of things. I can make it all different colors and everything, but this makes it so much easier because if you're giving this to someone who has no knowledge of spreadsheets, they can just play around with the pretty buttons and just filter as they please, right? They don't have to do a function to get the pivot data at this, right? Because this is going to look gibberish to anyone who is not taking a spreadsheet programming class. This, they're buttons, it's super straightforward. So we want to make things a little bit easier to see. Another really great thing about slicers, right, is if I had, let's say, dates instead of the, let's say, years or something, right, I could use a timeline. And what this timeline is going to show is it's going to show the data over time, right? That's what a timeline does. So here has specific dates, right, from 6/1 to 7/1. So if I include a timeline over here, right? Just like how I would over here, right? Select my my pivot table, go to analyze. I won't be able to because there's no date here. But if I do, right, I see right over here, it'll allow me to filter based on years, quarters, months, etc. And I can see the exact line of where these dates come from, right? Maybe I want to find what years were all of these computer science books published. Well, by using a timeline, I can see exactly that. I can say, oh, all of these timelines, all these books were published in the 2000s, let's say. So it would show from like 2000 to 2026. So it's a great way to show how time is progressing. So again, whatever type of data you have, just see what works best, right? Maybe a timeline if you have dates, maybe a slice if you want to just be able to easily filter based on whatever data that you have. All right, let's take a short break. We'll come back at about noon. Um, so yeah, just take a 10-minute break and we'll come back about noon. Alrighty, guys. I just had a bit of a technical issue with the Amplify, so I just put a second link on the Brightspace. So if you can, please use the second link and you can answer the couple of questions that are posted there. There are 4 questions that you can answer there. So if you take a look. Okay, right over here. You can skip this stuff over here that we did already. There's this one over here. 2, 3, actually, oops. Okay, 2, 3, and 4. So just answer these 4 really quick, and then we will go over them. Okay, so let's go over them. So, if I want to sum up only a range that is unhidden on the screen, which formula should I use? So, we had gone over the difference between these 3 over here, right? The single digit 9 is going to show everything, no matter whether it's hidden or not hidden. We need the 109 here in order for it to only show what is showing on the screen, right? 109, the triple digits are going to be dynamic. The single digits are 9 is going to be static. And sum itself, right? This is going to end up working very similarly to just the plain old subtotal, right? So this is just going to display no matter what. But if we want things to just constantly change, we want to use that 109. And again, you don't have to necessarily memorize specific numbers corresponding to specific functions, but just know that the triple digits are dynamic, the single digits are static. Okay, there's a little bit of an issue here that they got copied together. But which function is used to extract specific summary values, such as the grand total, directly from a pivot table, right? So we want to get pivot table for this, right? So if we use any of the, okay, extract pivot and pivot match have nothing to do with this. V lookup, right? We've done our V and our H lookup tables, but this is not necessarily for a pivot table, right? This is going to fall into the same issue that we had with the pivot table test, right? If we change where the specific coordinates are, poof, there goes our formula. It's not going to work. Get pivot get pivot data, geez, is going to be the only one that actually is going to hard code the location itself. Okay, when you add a field containing quantitative numeric data to the values area of a pivot table, which is the default calculation function. So if we automatically put it in, right, and it sees that we have numbers, right, it's automatically going to try to do the sum function. If we were dealing with text, so not numbers, we would be doing the count function by default. Most of the time, when you are doing a function, right, the most common is that you want to count or find the total number of things that are within that column or row. So whether you're just counting the number or actually summing up the numbers themselves, right, those two are going to be the most common. If it's numeric, we want sum. If it's text, we want the count. Okay, and finally, what is the difference between slices and timelines? So slices can just filter general data, right? Those are those pretty boxes that we had where we got to click on the buttons and it would filter our data. It could be used for anything. Timelines, though, will only be good for dates, showing how dates change over time, right? Now, even though timelines can only be used on dates, that's true, but slices can be used on all kinds of data, right? We used it for text, we used it for different dates, we used it for different like prices, copyright year, all that kind of stuff. Slices can be used on any data. Timeline, though, can only be used for dates, and it will show how those dates change over time. Okay, so that is the end of that. Any questions before we go on to the last few parts? Okay, any questions? Doing all right? Okay, so calculated fields, right? Now, if we wanted to essentially change our data, right? If we wanted to manually find a total, if we wanted to find a sales tax, for instance, right? Okay, well, we could just straight up make a column here and do it that way, right? That's the way we're used to it. That is not good in practice because what's the main issue with pivot tables is they're constantly moving. I can't just say, oh, okay, uh, take the average of like the first five values. Well, if I filter this in a different way, those first five values can become the last five values. Things can shuffle at all times. So I can't hard code a formula with pivot tables. It is a horrible, horrible, horrible practice to hard code formulas with pivot tables. Instead, if I want to make some sort of function, right? In this example, maybe I want to find the total sales, right? The sales tax of it, right? I can use the calculated fields box for this. So by doing it this way, I can put in the name of whatever fields I want, right? This is just essentially like creating another column. And I create a formula. I hard code the formula so that it is always applied on the total sales column. So this is telling me take everything in the total sales box, right? It's coming from this field and multiply it by 1.05. So if I have that over here, right? I'm on my pivot table over here, right? And if I want to essentially just kind of like change things, or if I want to essentially create those calculated fields, right? Uh, just had that before, and of course I lost it. Ah, there we go. Okay. It's like all of these crazy little functions that are just hiding somewhere in the ribbon, right? You just got to kind of play around with it, get yourself a little bit used to it. So with something like this, right? Let's say I want to take the sum of the wholesale units, or if I want to find the average, or if I want to just say, take all of these guys and say maybe another 20 people bought them, right? And I don't want to manually write in this number plus 20, plus this number plus 20, this number plus 20. I don't want to constantly just add 20 manually because, we're humans, we're prone to error. We need to use formulas for this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to be in my pivot table analyze. I'm going to go here to calculated fields, right? And I could just call it whatever I want. The name doesn't really matter. And I can make a formula here, right? So I can take the sum of the wholesale units sold, right? Could take this, click on here, insert field, right? Let me get rid of that 0. We don't need that. And I can say plus 20, right? So I could take however many that is, right? And I could add another 20 to it, right? So I could name it whatever I want. That's not a problem. I can click OK. All right. So now this pops up in my values down here, right? So this is a value that is in here. It's just not being displayed right now on my pivot table. How do I display it? Well, I can just put that here, right? That's exactly what we have going on here. You could ignore the field 1. That was just my own test. But this sum of field 2, right? This is taking this number and adding 20 to it. Taking this number, adding 20 to it. This number, adding 20 to it, right? And I'm going to just take off the field 1 just so we could just see this, right? I could change this name to anything I want, but this is a stable formula that allows me to do that. If I did not do this, right? If I manually change things, well, first of all, we can't manually change things in a pivot table, right? I try changing things, I get myself an error. How do I change things without changing the original data? I have to do it this way through my calculations, right? Pivot table analyze, go to fields, calculated fields, and this allows me to actually add on data. This is great if you want to show projections or if you want to show something that's not necessarily pure data. Because again, what is a pivot table? It's just a projection of data. You want to display the sum with 20 extra people on it, maybe that's a projected thing. We think that 20 people are going to buy this new textbook, right? Maybe the next class is going to be buying that, right? This does not change my original data, right? This stays the same. All of this, nothing changed here. The only thing that changed, not even here, was just in this column. And I could just get rid of this column like it never happened. So calculated fields is great for showing perspective, projective, whatever type of cost that you might have. It's the only way that you can honestly edit a pivot table without changing the original data. And you can kind of sort through a whole bunch of different things, right? You don't necessarily just have to write it out formatted just as like a number or letter, date, whatever. I could make it in percentages. I could actually have it as If I want to have it more as like a fraction, right? Maybe I want to show someone's score, right? I could take all of your scores, right, and calculate them as a percentage. Maybe you want to know how your numerical score calculates to a alphabetical score. Well, I can do this and I can keep my original data exactly the same. So this is great for when you want to display data, apply a function to that data, right? But don't change the original. Okay, so you could do all kinds of things with our pivot tables. Now, we want to add more color to it, right? Maybe you're just not a fan of this blue. Kind of boring. Just like with any old table, I could go to the design tab and everything that's in a normal table is for pivot tables too. I could change the colors, I can make banded rows and banded columns. Makes it a little easier to see. I could get rid of my headers if I want, make column headers if I want. I could do all kinds of things. Anything that you might have in a regular table can be done on a pivot table too. Okay. And let's see. So the last thing that we'd be going over, right, is relations between data, right? So if anyone here is interested in data science at all, this is heavily related to how databases are stored. So we know that we have all of our data, we can sort through it. Whole purpose of pivot tables was being able to create that kind of projection. But what if I want to, relate two tables that maybe aren't together, right? Maybe I have a pivot table here and I have another pivot table here and I want to relate them to each other. Well, we can do this using data models. So we need to identify a couple of different keys for this. So the primary key is going to be a very unique key, right? Think about it. If I have two tables and I have two types of students, let's say, right? Two classes of students, and two of them are both named Bob, right? How am I going to decipher whether it's Bob from class A or Bob from class B? I need a primary key that can differ between the two. That could be something like a student ID. Bob 1 and Bob 2 are definitely going to have different student IDs. They're not the same Bob. So that is going to be our primary key. We'll also need a foreign key. A foreign key is what's going to actually relate these two references. So if let's say it's the name Bob, right? There's a Bob in class 1 and a Bob in class 2. This could be a foreign key that relates the two. Or for instance, maybe they're both taking a spreadsheet programming class. Anything that is the same in both classes in both tables is considered a foreign key. Think of it as like a foreign exchange student. You speak two languages, right? You relate between the two of them. And that's how essentially we're going to be able to create a relationship between them. So again, if you have like an ID, that could be like your primary key, and it relates to, let's say, the representative's first name and last name from this table. And this acts as a foreign key as well as a primary key because no one has the same ID. And it relates to all of these options as well. So if you have a representative here and you're relating them here, these are two completely different tables. But because of this rep ID, I can relate this person with all of their sales, right? If I'm doing like a cashier, I sign in with my ID, boom, I can access not only my name and personal information, but I can access all my sales, the date that they had, etc. So this is how we're able to essentially link tables together. Once we have that key, then it just becomes as simple as creating a relationship. So we have our representatives here and we have the sales here, right? So this is just their ID and their name, right? And we link again their ID with the sales and their date. So our foreign key, right, is the representative ID. 1, 2, 3, 4 is found in both tables. This is how we are going to be able to relate them. They also act as our primary key because no one has the same ID as someone else. All of the keys for one are going to go for Shandi. All of the keys for two are going to go to Ideal, no matter what it is. So once we know those keys, right, I go to my filter and I can create our relationship. I'm sorry, not my filter. I go in my data tab, I go to data model, right? And this is going to allow me to create a relationship. So I take my two tables, right? Table one and table two. This is the sales and the reps. And I have to identify, tell Excel what my foreign key and primary key is. Once I know that, right? We identify that, I pass it to Excel, and boom, Excel is going to do all of the work for me. So as soon as I tell it, okay, ID is the foreign key, right? It's relating the two. And it's also our primary key because no one has the same ID. They could be the same, they could be different, right? I don't need the foreign key to equal the primary key, but I just need some ways to relate the two. Once I do that, then I tell it where I want it to go, of course, if I want it on a new worksheet or the same one. But then I create a pivot table that combines all of this, right? As soon as I tell it what is related to it, boom, I get all of my data all together. So if I ever want to combine two things, don't do it manually. Just use a data model for that. And we can design and format it just like any old table. This is just another type of pivot table. Okay, and finally, the very last thing, if I want to create a chart based on a pivot table, I have to use what's called a pivot chart. So if I take my pivot table from before, right, I'm going to go to Insert. Now I'm going to see over here, next to my charts, there's a pivot chart. And this is going to have all the same formats that I had from my regular chart, but it's based on this specific pivot table. So it's automatically going to create all the labels and everything for it, right? But it's going to be based on this view right here. So if I take things off of this view, they get taken off of the chart itself. So it's a great way of seeing specific data without changing my original one. Because again, if I were to create a regular chart from this, right? If I go to insert recommended charts or whatever, okay, well, this is the sorted data already, but it would not have this specific view because there is way more data for this, right? It's not letting me actually create a chart for this because there's way too much data going on here, right? I'd have to select a small piece of it, right? If I did something like that, right? Or if I even did like two columns from that, that's totally fine. But I can't have this entire thing, right? So if I have so much data that I need to condense it down into a smaller projection, do that with my pivot table. You got a pivot table, you got to use a pivot chart. Okay, and you can format that same way as a normal chart. So it just pretty much works the same way, just for the actual pivot table. Basically, pivot tables are our projections. With that, we've reached the end of chapter 5. If you have any questions, let me know. And just as a reminder, right, today, what was posted, you guys started chapter 5's lab already. You'll finish the project tomorrow in class. These are the homework assignments, and you're going to have just these 3 chapters due on Monday, right? So even though Monday will have its own stuff assigned, you're obviously going to have more time for that because that's going to be the next week. So for the time being, if you haven't already, please, please, please submit anything from week 1. This is the hard deadline. There's no more extensions past this. And if you've done it already, maybe get started on some of the stuff for chapter 5. But otherwise, you're all good. And if you have any questions, just email me Or, oh, I have a question. Please go over slices and timelines one more time. Absolutely. But you
Professor,
guys, yeah, what's up?
for for the extra credit, is that going to be applied once you submit the grades?
Yes. So
Okay.
what I'm gonna do is, yeah, I'm gonna submit the grades first, and then I'm gonna change. Actually, I'm gonna just check to see like if you've done it, and if you have done it, then I'm just gonna add the points to your midterm score from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Professor. Have a good
Of
one.
course. Yeah, you too. If you guys could just fill out the last slide on the Amplify and then head out for the day. Okay. While you guys work on that, we can definitely go over slices and timelines one more time. I see there's a question there. So we'll go over that. But again, as soon as you finish the Amplify, you can head out for the day, enjoy the weather and everything. So if I go back to, so I'll just go back to the Excel that I was working on here, get rid of this pivot chart over here. So slices and timelines are both found in the same place, right? Pivot table, analyze, and they're right next to each other, right? They're very heavily related. But the difference is if I insert a slicer, right, I can choose what I want specifically. And what it does is it creates these little interactive boxes and they allow me to slice my data. So if I want all books that are copyright 2025, I can click on this button and without using any functions on my own, it automatically formats it super nicely. So this is an awesome way of essentially filtering data on the fly, right? It allows my data to be way more interactable, right? I don't have to like go into the filter menu, type in, is it equal to this, etc. This is as simple as clicking a button. So if you have someone who's like, maybe you have a boss that's not very good with spreadsheets, right? You can do this as an accessibility feature for them, and they can just filter through the data super, super easily. And you can use any of the columns, right? If I wanted to add, if I had a pivot table that had a lot more stuff going on here, right? This has a lot of stuff, right? Same way as before, I can create a slicer for any of this. Now there's way more columns, but I can create a slicer for any of it that I want. Timelines are a little bit different. Timelines are only used for dates. So if I wanted to take a look at a timeline instead, right? My data itself does not have dates on it, right? But if I saw, for instance, over here, I see that I have June 2027 to July 2027. These are going to show all of these sales were made from June to July. So if I clicked on the timeline tab, right? Again, same place, it's just up here instead, next to the slicer. It's going to show a range from June to July. And I could filter this a little bit more. Maybe it was a much shorter time period. It was only in days. I could filter it by days, right? If this was a list of sales for maybe the week of the 4th of July, right? I could filter based on a shorter or longer time period. So essentially, timeline is for dates, slices are for our general data. Does that kind of clear it up a bit? Awesome. Yeah. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to end the recording here.